It was a Saturday morning in October when Robert decided he'd finally run out of excuses. The old storage shed at the back of his property had been accumulating decades worth of equipment, old paint cans, folded tarps, and things he kept telling himself he'd sort through eventually. His wife had gone to visit their daughter for the weekend. The weather was cool and dry. It was, by every reasonable measure, a perfect day for the job. He grabbed a paper dust mask from the garage, the kind left over from a painting project 2 summers back, pulled on a pair of worn leather gloves, and pushed open the shed door. The smell hit him first. That particular combination of rust and old wood and something else, something organic and dry. He swept the concrete floor with a push broom. Dust rose in a column through the shaft of morning light coming through the cracked window. He worked for about 3 hours, then came inside, showered, and made himself lunch. By Sunday evening, he had a mild headache. He assumed he'd been dehydrated. By Tuesday, he had a fever of 100.4 and aches deep in his thighs and lower back. He took some ibuprofen and went to bed early. By Thursday morning, he couldn't finish a sentence without stopping to catch his breath. His wife came home Friday. She called 911 within 20 minutes of walking through the door. What happened to Robert in the space of 6 days is one of the most medically under-recognized dangers in rural and semi-rural North America. Not because it's common, but because when it does happen, it moves with a speed and severity that most people never see coming. And the reason they don't see it coming is precisely because the beginning looks like absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. To understand what Robert unknowingly breathed in that Saturday morning, you have to understand a small, unremarkable animal called the deer mouse. The deer mouse is native to most of North America. It's tiny, barely 3 inches from nose to tail, and it doesn't seek human contact. It doesn't bite unless cornered. It doesn't look dangerous in any way. But the deer mouse carries a virus called sin nombre hantavirus, and it carries it silently, without getting sick from it, because over thousands of years of coevolution, the virus and the mouse reached a kind of biological agreement. The mouse's immune system tolerates the virus. The virus persists and sheds continuously in the mouse's saliva, in its urine, and in its droppings. When those droppings dry out and are disturbed, swept, kicked, blown by wind, microscopic viral particles become airborne. Not in large quantities, not in a dramatic cloud, just particles suspended in the ordinary dust of an ordinary space. And they only need one thing to cause devastation: to be inhaled. What makes this particularly difficult to reconcile is that you don't need to encounter a living mouse. You don't need a bite. You don't even need to see evidence of recent activity. The droppings of a mouse that passed through 6 months ago, left on a wooden shelf or pressed into a corner, can still carry live, viable hantavirus. Time does not reliably neutralize it. Ordinary disinfectants do, but time alone doesn't. The virus was formally identified in the United States in 1993 during a mysterious outbreak in the Four Corners region, the area where Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah meet. Young, healthy people, many of them Navajo, were dying of an unidentified respiratory illness. They had no travel history, no obvious contact with known pathogens, no explanation. Epidemiologists worked frantically to trace the source. What they eventually found was this. That year, El Niño rains had produced an extraordinary piñón pine cone harvest. More food meant a tenfold increase in the deer mouse population. More mice pressing into human spaces, leaving traces in more homes, barns, and sheds. The deaths weren't random. They were the consequence of an ecological cascade that nobody had been watching. That lesson has never fully reached the public consciousness, and it should have. When the virus enters the body, it makes its way to the lungs, and there it targets something very specific: the endothelial cells, the thin layer of cells that line the interior walls of the blood vessels threading through your lung tissue. This is where the real damage begins. These endothelial cells are the biological gatekeepers between your bloodstream and your lung tissue. When the virus begins replicating inside them, that barrier breaks down. Fluid from the bloodstream begins leaking through the vessel walls and into the alveoli, the tiny air sacs where oxygen normally crosses into the blood. As those sacs fill with fluid, they can no longer do their job. Oxygen exchange collapses. The medical term for this is pulmonary edema. In plain language, it means your lungs are filling from the inside, not from anything you've inhaled, but from your own fluid, driven there by viral damage to the vessels meant to contain it. And then your immune system arrives. In some patients, the immune response to hantavirus is so intense that it makes things significantly worse. The immune system floods the affected tissue with inflammatory chemicals, a response researchers call a cytokine storm. Your own defenses, recruited to fight the virus, end up contributing to the destruction of the very tissue they're trying to protect. The lungs, already compromised by fluid accumulation, now face an inflammatory assault from within. This is not unique to hantavirus. It's a pattern seen in several severe respiratory illnesses. But in Hantavirus Pulmonary Syndrome, it happens with particular speed and force in patients who were completely healthy just days before. The most treacherous feature of this illness is its opening act. For the first 3 to 5 days, Hantavirus Pulmonary Syndrome looks exactly like the flu. Fatigue, fever, muscle aches, often severe in the hips, thighs, and back. Sometimes a mild headache. Sometimes nausea. No rash. No cough at first. Nothing on a physical exam that would stop a doctor in their tracks. This is what physicians call the prodromal phase, the period before the disease declares itself. And during that window, there is no widely available bedside test that catches it. A blood count might show some subtle abnormalities, but nothing definitive. A chest X-ray in the first few days is often completely clear. Robert's doctor, reached by phone on Wednesday, did nothing wrong. He heard a description that matched a dozen common viral illnesses and gave the standard sensible advice: rest, fluids, call back if things worsen. That advice is entirely appropriate for what was described. The problem isn't medical negligence. The problem is that Hantavirus Pulmonary Syndrome has been engineered by biology itself to be invisible at the moment when early recognition could matter most. For adults over 50, this window carries additional risk. As we age, the immune system undergoes a gradual shift that researchers have given a quietly unsettling name: inflammaging. It describes a state of chronic, low-level systemic inflammation that accumulates over decades, influenced by metabolic health, past infections, stress, sleep quality, and diet. In a person with inflammaging, the initial immune recognition of a new pathogen can be slower and more muddled, while the eventual response, once it fully mobilizes, can be disproportionately violent. This is not a sentence on older adults. It is a description of a biological reality that makes early information and early communication with a physician more consequential, not less. By Thursday morning, Robert's wife came home to find him seated at the kitchen table, leaning slightly forward, speaking in fragments. His lips had a faint blue tinge that she later said she almost dismissed as a trick of the morning light. She didn't dismiss it. In the emergency room, the chest X-ray told an immediate story: bilateral infiltrates, a spreading whiteness across both lung fields where there should be nothing but dark, air-filled space. The attending physician asked Robert's wife if she could think of anything unusual in recent days. She mentioned the shed. She mentioned the droppings. She mentioned the broom. That single piece of information activated the correct diagnostic pathway. Hantavirus Pulmonary Syndrome, once it reaches this stage, carries a case fatality rate of roughly 36 to 50%, even with aggressive intensive care. There is no antiviral medication proven effective against it in humans. There is no targeted pharmaceutical intervention. Treatment is entirely supportive: mechanical ventilation to sustain oxygen delivery, careful fluid management to slow the accumulation in the lungs, and time. Enough time for the immune response to recalibrate before it does irreversible damage. At some hospitals with access to ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, a machine that temporarily performs the work of the heart and lungs outside the body, survival rates have been meaningfully higher. But ECMO is not universally available, and initiating it requires early, decisive action. The margin between survivable and unsurvivable can shrink within hours. Not everyone exposed to hantavirus develops severe illness. Not everyone who develops illness dies. The question of who survives and why is one of the more fascinating and underappreciated frontiers in viral immunology. Research into hantavirus outcomes has pointed toward the role of regulatory T cells, a class of immune cells whose function is essentially to moderate the immune response itself, ensuring that the inflammatory reaction remains proportionate. Patients with robust regulatory T cell activity appear better equipped to fight the virus without the immune system tipping into the self-destructive overcorrection that causes the worst outcomes. This regulatory capacity is influenced in part by overall metabolic health. Chronic inflammation from unmanaged blood sugar, sedentary living, or sustained sleep disruption has measurable effects on immune regulation. The conditions most people associate with cardiovascular risk quietly affect the immune system's ability to respond precisely rather than catastrophically. This does not mean that a person in poor metabolic health is doomed by an exposure, or that a person in excellent health is guaranteed to survive. It means that the biological conditions we create through daily choices over many years are genuinely reflected in how our bodies respond to serious acute threats. That is not a reason for despair. It is one of the clearest arguments in existence for the cumulative value of taking care of yourself across a lifetime. The environments where hantavirus exposure is most likely are not remote or exotic. They are the ordinary spaces at the edges of ordinary lives. Rural vacation properties left closed through winter. Storage sheds, barns, and outbuildings that see infrequent human use. Crawl spaces beneath older homes in wooded or agricultural areas. Attics with gaps in the roofline. Camping sites in regions with established deer mouse populations. These are the spaces that people over 50 encounter most frequently through seasonal work. Opening a lake cabin in spring, clearing out a family property, beginning a restoration project. The prevention is specific and it is effective. Before entering any enclosed space that may have had rodent activity, ventilate it thoroughly. Open doors and windows and allow fresh air to circulate for at minimum 30 minutes. Do not dry sweep any area where you see droppings or nesting material. Instead, saturate the area with a disinfectant solution. A mixture of 1 part bleach to 10 parts water works well. Allow it to soak for 5 full minutes, then wipe using paper towels disposed of directly into a sealed bag. The respirator you wear matters. A standard paper dust mask or a cloth face covering does not provide adequate filtration. An N95 respirator, properly fitted with a seal against the face, substantially reduces the inhalation of the aerosol particles that carry the virus. This is not overcaution. It is the specific, evidence-based tool for the specific risk. Sealing points of entry into your home or outbuildings is the upstream intervention. A deer mouse can compress its body to pass through an opening roughly the diameter of a pencil. Steel wool packed into gaps, followed by caulk, and hardware cloth over larger openings, addresses the root of the problem rather than managing its consequences. Beyond all of this, there is one behavioral change that costs nothing and may matter more than any other. When you are sick, when you have flu-like symptoms that have lasted more than a day or two, tell your doctor specifically where you have been and what you have been doing in the past 4 to 6 weeks. Not just your travel history, your work history, your weekend projects, the spaces you cleaned, opened, or worked in. This is not information that physicians routinely ask for, and it is not information that patients routinely volunteer. The connection between a shed cleaned in October and a fever in November is not intuitive. But in the world of hantavirus, that connection is everything. Robert survived. After 11 days in the intensive care unit, 9 of them on a ventilator, he came home. His lungs took months to recover their full capacity. He has not been back inside that shed without an N95 respirator and proper protective gloves since. His survival was not guaranteed by medical technology alone. It was enabled, in a very specific and traceable way, by his wife's memory, by the fact that she had paid attention to what he'd been doing that weekend, by the fact that she named it in the emergency room when it mattered. Between 1993 and the present day, the CDC has confirmed more than 800 cases of Hantavirus Pulmonary Syndrome in the United States. The case fatality rate has barely moved in 30 years, not because medicine has failed to advance, but because the recognition consistently arrives too late. What changes that is not a new drug. It is not a new protocol. It is the slow, quiet accumulation of people who understand what they're dealing with before they're dealing with it. People who wear the right mask, who wet the droppings before they sweep them, who mention the shed, who know, before anything goes wrong, that this exists and what it looks like. That knowledge is now yours. What you do with it is entirely up to you.